Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya vaitikena yopakrotam pravaram muninam patanjalim pranchaliranatosmi stuve patanjalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam kartrusutrasya bhashyasya kramat vivaranasya cha. We are continuing our discussion on the Yoga Sutras in the first chapter, Samadhipada. I think we have been discussing the sixth sutra we are discussing, and the sixth sutra, it extends to a number of continuing sutras. The sixth one is a description, a brief description of what vrittis are, the five vrittis. So before that, the previous sutra is Vritaya Panchataya Klishtaha Klishtaha. That is the fifth sutra. I mean, vrittis are fivefold. Klishta vrittis and aklishta vrittis. That we already discussed. But for those who are interested, we should keep in mind that the first few sutras of Samadhipada are taken up because they consist of definitions of some of the very fundamental teachings and concepts of yoga, including the basic definition of yoga, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That's how it begins. Now, Chittam we already discussed. Vrittis are being discussed. What are vrittis? Vritti, the word, is a Sanskrit word and is often translated into waves, so modifications, so changes, residual effects, and so on. It's very difficult to correctly, accurately translate that into a different language, because the problem of language and problem of translation. So what is vritti? Vritti is nothing but what is left in our mind after we do something, after any activity that we undertake. Not physical activity alone, but even a word we speak, which is a verbal activity, our thought, ideas, not necessarily correct ideas, wrong ideas, even ideas that we derive when we read a book, a novel, or a short story, or read a poem, or if we listen to gossip, if we read newspapers. All these can actually create vrittis, because our mind connects itself with so many ideas, so many concepts. All these can create vrittis, as we are going to find out. For example, if you will discuss that right now. So these vrittis are fivefold: pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smriti. So we already discussed pramana vrittis. Pramana, technically, it deals with the theory of knowledge, epistemology. In Yoga Sutra, three tools of theory of knowledge are accepted: the pratyaksha, anumana, and shabda. Pratyaksha is direct perception, anumana is inference, which is those who have studied Plato and Aristotle will know. They have elaborate descriptions of different kinds of inferences, different concepts of sense perceptions you find. So more or less you find in Western logic, and also in the more systematic philosophical concepts belonging to pre-Christian Greek thought. And I want to emphasize this point because right from 6th century AD up to the emergence of Kant in Germany, philosophy practically did not have any life in Western world. It is considered to be the dark age for philosophy in Western world, right from the advent of Augustine in the 5th century AD up to Kant. So anyway, that's a different subject. But if we go to the pre-Christian Greek philosophers, the sophists, even the later Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists like Porphyry, Democritus, you find very systematic, very, very, very close in many ways to the parallel Indian development of epistemology, which of course took place much earlier. The early development of Indian logic it begins with Gautama, the great sage who lived around 13th century BC. The Gautama Nyaya, the first phase in the development of Indian logic. Then Madhyama Nyaya, right from 5th or 4th century AD onwards, and then later Navya. So anyway, that is a different subject. So you find here perception, inference, and verbal testimony constitute what you call valid knowledge. So if you perceive something, or if you infer something, inference is again linked to perception. And also when you read a book, when you read the Bible, which corresponds roughly to verbal testimony in the parallel Christian tradition, or Vedas for Vedantins or Hindus, or Buddha's teachings. Of course, they do not accept any teachings as a verbal testimony, the Buddhist philosophers. They don't accept, because they only believe in the first two pramanas, means tools of epistemology. So I gave a brief description of the extended tools of epistemology or theory of knowledge in Indian philosophical systems, which I discussed in the last and the previous to last classes. So that is 7th sutra. Now, in the 8th sutra, you find the next set of vrittis are described. Pramana, viparyaya is described. Viparyaya is, that is 8th sutra. Viparyayo mithya jnanam adadruva pradishtham. This is the sutra. Viparyaya. What is viparyaya? Viparyaya is false knowledge based on wrong object. So false knowledge of something which actually doesn't correspond to the real form. So that is pramanena viparyaya, that means illusion of silver. One classical example: you are walking on the seashore and you see something that is brilliant, that resembles, because of its brilliance, it resembles a piece of silver, but it is not silver. It is mother of pearl, some sort of maybe a shell of some small creatures that grow in seawater. So they shed the shells on the seashore. And when you walk, especially when there is brilliant sunlight, it shines brilliantly. So you may mistake it for silver. It's a classical stock example from Indian philosophical systems, It is, Rajatam is silver. Shuktika is the mother of pearl, that outer shell of a tiny creature, whose shell resembles, because of its brilliance in sunlight, the brilliance of a piece of silver. It is a classic example of false knowledge. You get a knowledge, but your knowledge doesn't correspond to the object in front of you. So that is viparyaya, based on wrong object. But it can certainly create a vritti in your mind. Suppose you're walking on the seashore, you didn't specifically investigate the object in front of you, but you thought it's a piece of silver. And when you go to sleep, if you are a child, if you're a boy, if you're a young girl, during your younger days, you may have a desire to possess that piece of silver, which you may think that it's a wonderful thing to play with if you are a little child. And then at night, in the evening, you may cry, I want that object which I saw on the seashore. So you can see the example of vritti. There was no silver, but you mistook something for a silver, and you expressed a desire, you developed a desire in your mind for that object, and the vritti again is brought forth, and the child cries for the silver, or you may see that silver in dream. So memories again can become active, and memories can reproduce the image of an object which actually did not exist, but you thought it existed. It's a classic example of viparyaya. So avidya, asmita, raga, desha, abhinivesha, these are kleshas. So these kleshas are linked to these vrittis, so they are called klesha vrittis. Somebody raised a question I found later on in the YouTube, that is, what is the difference between vikalpa and viparyaya? So the 9th sutra defines vikalpa. Shabda jnana anupavadhi vastu shunyo vikalpaka. So Shabda jnana anupati means it's a kind of conceptual knowledge which is devoid of corresponding object. And again, but it is considered by knowledge which arises from words. So vikalpa is not necessarily based on any object. Vikalpa need not have any corresponding object. But viparyaya will have an object. Again, we should remember, we are discussing vrittis. Vrittis are nothing but impressions, ideas, concepts, which can become desires, attachments, aversions, and so on in our mental world, which when there is an object which you did not understand correctly, but still there is an object, there is a corresponding object, understood doesn't correspond to the real form of the object, that is a false idea that is based on wrong object, it is called viparyaya. An idea that doesn't have a corresponding object at all is called vikalpa. This vikalpa is different from vikalpa as used in Vedanta. So that should be understood. Vikalpa can mean options in Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. So we have to remember, in Indian philosophy, the same word can have different meanings in different systems of philosophy. A word can have one meaning in Vedanta, another meaning in Sankhya, an entirely different meaning in Yoga, even though they are linked to each other, and totally different meaning in Nyaya and logic, and so on. Of course, I'm not extending these examples. So this is an important point, remember. Now, what is viparyaya? Of course, there are many examples here. Vastu shunyatve api shabdajnana mahatma nibandhano vyavaharo drishyate. Vastu shunyatve api, that is Vyasa's commentary. So whenever we want to get a correct, as far as possible, correct understanding of what Patanjali means, you have to go to Vyasa. Or you have to go to other commentators like Vachaspati or Vijnana Bhikshu or Shankara's Vivarana. So this is an important point. Very often when we read modern translations by translators who have no familiarity with the traditional interpretations, who mostly base their interpretations on their own understanding or modern psychology, there is every chance that you may go wrong. But Vyasa is very, very precise, absolutely precise. See, Vastu Shunyate api Sabdajnana Mahatma Nibandhano Vyavaharo Drishyate. An object doesn't exist corresponding to the particular vritti. Still, you may act as if such an object really exists. So, Bhoja, another commentator, says, Vikalpa is Shabdajnanam Tanubadidum Sheelam Yasya Sa Shabdajnana Anupati, etc. So, knowledge produced by words is called verbal knowledge, the knowledge which thus habitually follows the words and its meaning, which actually may not exist in some cases. To give an example, I can give different examples of vikalpas. One kind of vikalpas, see, knowledge of totally non-existent entities. Sometimes we may get certain vikalpas. For example, patriotism, truth, goodness, beauty. Beauty has some kind of a visual counterpart, but patriotism, let's say truth, goodness, all these you may read in books, and all these are wonderful things. Or you may read in novels, short stories, description of imaginary writings, stories, etc. These are all different examples of vikalpas. One kind of vikalpas is knowledge of non-existent things. Things that really cannot even intellectually be conceived of. So again, the classical commentators give an example, stock example, used in different Indian philosophical classics. Mrigatrishnam bhasisnadaha kapushpa dhrudashekadaha eshavandhyasuto yadi shashasringa dhanurdharaha. It's an ancient Sanskrit verse. What it means is, you are describing a person absolutely unreal, unrealistic. It is impossible for such a person to exist. Who is the person? He is a person who has taken a bath or may have swimming in a pool of water in the middle of a desert. An example. It cannot happen. When you see a desert from a distance, the desert resembles a pool of water or a river. From a even big, broad highways and freeways also can resemble a pool of water in the midday, during midday, when there is blazing sun overhead. Because of sunlight, the wide expanse of desert or sand can resemble a pool of water. So here a description. A man is going, he has taken a bath, a dip in that pool of water in the middle of a desert. That means such a man doesn't exist, because such a pool doesn't and cannot exist. Kapushpa dhrudashekara means, and he is wearing a flower in his long hair. The flower he has picked up from a garden in the sky cannot exist. It's an example of vikalpas. Esha vandhya suto yadi, and the son of a mother who is barren. Shashasringa dhanurdharaka, and he has got a bow and arrow with him, which is made of horns of hair. Now what does it mean? Such a person cannot exist. You may read fantasy books, you may read many things. Of course, that's what you read, what you watch when you travel in planes, to keep people engaged, to forget the strain of travel, terrible things, thrillers, all those things. Cannot exist. Even intellectually we cannot think of. It's an example of vikalpa. But remember, those experiences don't leave a blank in your mind. When you come back to your home, you may dream that you are in that corn island, which I happened to watch once. Terrible thing, Absolutely ridiculous and childish, but then that's enough to keep you engaged and fill your mind with plenty of vikalpas. This is one kind of vikalpa. Then abstract nouns, strength, goodness, all these also can create vikalpas. And then imaginary characters, stories, impressions that you read in books, in fiction, in movies, also can create vikalpas. These vikalpa vrittis are created. So children crying in when they see nightmares, because they have read something in a fantasy book and the vritti is registered in the mental system, and then these vrittis come alive in dreams. So what happens? The fact that is totally unrealistic is forgotten, that is, and this imaginary thing takes the form of something real. So, and it relives in the mind of the person because it leaves a vritti behind. Then also pratikas, certain mantras, certain symbols, verbal symbols, also can create helpful vrittis. If you chant some devotional hymns, mantras, prayers, psalms, any person from any religious tradition, if you chant with great intimacy of feeling a sacred mantra, that also can create vrittis in your mind. If you read a book of a great spiritual person, a mystic or whoever may be, and then what happens? Your mind has absorbed a lot of ideas, lot of vrittis by reading those things, which may be helpful vrittis actually. There are also many vrittis which are helpful even in spiritual life. So vrittis registered in the mental world by associations with spiritual persons, by reading holy books, by discussion on some very sublime spiritual topics, will be helpful for spiritual life. They all can produce vrittis. Then daydreaming, visualizations of forms, all these can create vrittis. These are examples of vikalpa vrittis. So some of these vrittis may have a corresponding object, but not directly. So you read a book on patriotism, but you also read the life of a person who was a great patriot. Then what happens? The two can merge and it can create a strong vritti in the mind. So this is a blending of the real and unreal. A real historical person and an abstract concept of patriotism, goodness, strong, can blend together. Now we can imagine how Patanjali in a short pity statement refers to this, and how Vyasa and other commentators, Raja Martanda was a well-known book written by a king. His name was Bhoja. He was the emperor of India, which at that time India extended all the way from extreme south right up to today's Afghanistan. Huge Indian empire. It existed around 4th century AD. King Bhoja was known as a wise king, archetypal wise man of that period. He wrote a gloss, a short commentary. It's called Raja Martanda. These are examples of vikalpas. In the 10th sutra, there is a description of another kind of vritti. It's called nidra. Nidra is sleep. Sleep also can be the result of vrittis, and the sleep also can produce vrittis in its turn. It's a special kind of vritti. Abhava pratyalambana vrittihi nidra. That is the definition. Abhava pratyalambana means is a kind of vritti which is the basis of experience of nothingness in sushupti, deep sleep. So sleep is a special kind of vritti which is the basis of the experience of nothingness, experience of a feeling of nothingness along with a feeling of total restfulness and relaxation that you normally experience during deep sleep. It's called sushupti in Sanskrit. So that is also one kind of a vritti. So the classical example, sukham aham aswapsam is a particular expression that is associated with the deep sleep. All that you can say And the only way for you to recollect what experience you had in deep sleep is, well, I had a wonderful rest, I had a wonderful sleep. The wonderful, blissful, restful is all that you can say. Because there is total absence of duality. That means we are one with ourselves. When we experience something apart from ourselves, when the subject-object distinction, difference, there is the scope for conflict, restlessness, friction, and so on. When you feel yourself alone, when you are in your own company, and you forget everything, and there is a total transcendence of duality. That experience, it is not samadhi or anything, but that experience gives you something that distantly resembles samadhi, because the experience of duality is absent in deep sleep. So this is an example of vritti called nidra. That means here. So tasma pratyavishesho nidra, that's Vyasa says, is a kind of experience, special experience. I mean, there is experience of some kind of a happiness or happiness, etc. Those of you who have any doubt about the vrittis, those of you have read the Buddha's the Jataka tales, Buddha's 543, maybe innumerable previous life cycles which he experienced when he was doing meditation, penance, sitting under the Bodhi tree. You can remember Buddha, when he was 28 years old, he had these visions, different visions, when he was being taken on a chariot, going for a ride in the streets of his own capital city. He saw a sick man sitting in the street corner, and he saw a dead body being taken to the cremation ground in a procession, and he saw an old man looking miserable, a pathetic sight. And then he saw another person who was an aged person, who was absolutely serene, calm and quiet. He was a saint, a sage. So Buddha wanted to be like the last mentioned sage. His face showed no pain, no worry. So Buddha realized that there are things like old age, death and sickness. And it is also possible for one to be free from all this. He wanted to find an answer, and he walked more than 1,000 miles, reached Bodh Gaya, sat under the tree and meditated for long years. That is how the story goes. Ihasane sushyudu me shariram tugasti mamsam cha vilayam cha yatuhu aprapi siddhim bhujanma durlabham naivasanat kayamatas chalishyate. Satsya Ghosha, the biographer of Buddha, writes in this Buddha Charita. He sat under the tree with a strong determination. I won't get up from this seat, going to meditate till I realize the ultimate truth, till I get spiritual enlightenment, emancipation. And as he sat there for meditating, for years rolled by, during this time, all the imageries, all the impressions of his previous life cycles flashed through his mind, one after another. So Buddha suddenly saw himself going through, living through, re-experiencing all these. He was in the previous life cycle, sometimes he was born as a king, sometimes as a common man, sometimes even as a monkey, sometimes even as different members of the animal kingdom. But in each of these previously incarnations, he had displayed some aspect of his great spiritual wisdom. So it was an ascent spiritual ascent to what he became in the last of his birth. That is, he was born as Siddhartha. He was born as the prince of a king in Nepal. The name of the king was Suddhodana. That was the last birth. In that last birth, he became the real Buddha, the enlightened one. So, all these vrittis, according to Vedanta and according to Yoga and according to Buddhism, all these vrittis remain stored up in our mind, in a mental world. Some of them are very good, some of them are not very good. Some of them we experience, we re-experience. Some of these vrittis actually manifest in this life itself. Some of the vrittis do not manifest in this life. These vrittis become solidified. So they become strong tendencies, and they are stored up in a repository of all these vrittis. It's called karmashaya, you find. These vrittis begin to manifest only in the next life. Some of the vrittis will manifest in this life itself. Some of the vrittis, samskaras, will find expression only in the succeeding life cycles. So whatever vrittis we accumulate, we don't lose them. So it's very important for everyone to acquire as far as possible good tendencies, good impressions, good ideas. Even a casual sight of something which may be disturb the mind, if we are not careful, when our mind is attached to it, then that experience will register a strong impression in our chittam, in our mental system. And this will manifest in some way or other. In some way or other, these vrittis will express itself. They are never lost. But it doesn't mean that whatever we see will produce a vritti. We should not mistake that. Okay, I can give an example. Suppose you are walking in the street. You may see many things. Trees, vehicles, stones, pebbles, dry leaves on the road. They don't create any vrittis in your mind, because we do not take notice of them. But suppose something else happens, something that creates a strong impression in our mind. Suppose we see something very interesting in which we happen to be involved. Let us say a dog from the nearby home starts barking at you and chases you. That you are not likely to forget. And you will find that that same dog is chasing you in your dream. And this memory can remain depending upon the type of person and the impact of that experience at that time. That vritti will remain stored up in the mind. So whatever we see and experience may not necessarily produce a vritti. It can create a vritti, but it is immediately forgotten, neutralized. Every vritti can be neutralized by counter vritti. Pratipaksha bhavanam, that's an important point in yoga. You can actually neutralize all the negative vrittis, or weaken, at least weaken negative vrittis in our mind. Suppose we have attitudes, ideas, habits, certain obsessions, which become some kind of delusions, memories which you don't want. They can be neutralized or weakened by producing a counter vritti. So, a healthy vritti can be generated. A person who is suffering from problem of greed, which we discussed in one of our sessions. That person can read a book which tells him the story of a king who fell on bad days, who met with a tragedy because of greed. Now that will weaken his vritti, which acts as greed. so it can be gone. Those who read spiritual books, is children, for example, in our schools. Children should be introduced to sublime stories, life stories of great men and great women, saints and sages and philosophers, not just technicians and technology fanatics, which only teach you how to press a button. And pressing a button is not a very big thing. It doesn't create a negativity or positivity. But when you read a great book, when you read a great life story of a great person, great in whatever ways, they can create healthy vrittis and can be a wonderful source for positive, constructive, creative education. It can be wonderful education material, really speaking. Because they produce vrittis. And vrittis influence mind. Because vrittis are always repeated. Vrittis will influence our attitude, our actions, and actions will be repeated. A child who is growing up reading something very wonderful will have a tendency to imbibe those qualities. It can become a wonderful way of training mind during younger days. So even the vikalpa vrittis have a positive use. This is an important point, remember. The 11th sutra deals with the 5th vritti. So pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smriti. That's the 5th one. So that's defined here. Anubhuti vishaya asampramoshaha smriti. That is the definition of smriti. Memory. Smriti means memory. Memory is not just remembering things. Memory that is accompanied by a corresponding samskara, an impression which tempts you to act in a way or to not act in a way. It could be either. So memory or smriti is not losing, not allowing an experience to slip away into the unconscious. Normally, we experience many things, and there are many things that we'll be happy to forget. And it's a great thing, Forgetfulness is a great gift from God, actually. Even in Gita, Chandi, there are many scriptures which tell you the ability to forget the unpleasant is a wonderful gift coming from God. So, but when you register a vritti, an impression, a memory in the mental system, which may not be very pleasant, and it always remains there. In obsessive psychosis, there are many cases of obsession may be linked to this vritti, certain vrittis. So, asampramosha is a technical word in the Sanskrit. What it means is, it doesn't have any wavering, it remains stuck. It remains stuck, it remains steady and steadfast. That particular memory remains stuck in the mental system. So that means not allowing an experience to slip into unconscious. It always remains at the conscious level. So it never gets lost. So that is smriti. This, of course, it has got different descriptions there. Vyasa, for example, he divides vritti into two types. Means bhavida vritti, and then sukha, dukkha vritti, etc. And I am not going to those details. Those who are interested can ask later. But in short, the point is, vrittis are fivefold. Pramana is vrittis are memories or impressions derived by normal understanding, perception, inference, and so on by reading some book, etc. Some of those vrittis are very good when you read a book, a holy book, which is one of the pramanas, or you see something wonderful. All these can be positive vrittis. Viparyaya, seeing wrong knowledge. Vikalpas are just conceptual. It has got many aspects. Even some of the fantasies that mind accumulates by reading books on fiction are examples of vikalpas. Nidra is sleep, deep sleep. That is also nidra. That's why every person has a tendency to re-experience deep sleep. People don't complain because they don't have dreams. They always complain when they do not have deep sleep, because it is deep sleep that gives you a feeling of total restfulness. So that vritti of blessedness, relaxation, is the fourth one. Fifth one is smriti. Now the 11th sutra tells you abhyasa vairagyabhyam tat nirodha. How to we can counteract certain negative vrittis. You may call negativity, you may call it. Of course, there are different ways. Vedanta will tell you you should become masters of our senses. We should control the mind. We should control the senses. We should not allow the visual objective world to influence and color our mind, our attitudes, and so on. These are great ideas. But Patanjali takes a very psychological approach in this context. So he says, Abhyasa and Vairagya. In this, before going deeper into what Abhyasa means, what Vairagya means, for the simple meaning is this: the restriction or restraining of these vrittis is attained through Abhyasa, means repeated practice, again and again. We should try. Every attempt consolidates our effort to restrain and reduce negativity and dispassion. That's why we often we insist on feeding the mind with good food, as I discussed earlier on many occasions. Feeding the mind with good food, which means give good food, good vrittis, good impressions to the mind. Mind remains neutral. So when you give good food to the mind, then mind becomes happy and mind becomes grateful to us, and then it doesn't create any conflict when we try to do something that we know to be good for us. Remember, what is conflict? Conflict is nothing but the negativity, the mental block that arises in the mind. When we try to do something that we know will be good for us, it's our own duty, our responsibility, something that we should do for our own good. When we are not able to do, when we are hampered in our effort to do what we should do by a set of negative tendencies, it's called mental block or negativity. So this negativity comes from negative vrittis, poisonous food that you have fed your mind with. So you should choose good food to the mind. What is good food? Things that produce good vrittis. That is the good food. That's the real good food. So that's why in the Vyasa's commentary there is a classic line which is often repeated in all the commentaries that were written subsequently. I can read from Vyasa. Chittanadi nama ubhayatapovahini vakadi kalyanaya vakadi papaya cha. That is first line. Chitta Nadi means mind is compared to a river. Nadi means long river. Ubhayatapovahini, it moves in both directions. The real river moves in only one direction. But the mind river, it moves simultaneously in both directions. It moves in the positive direction for our own good. And it moves towards the right direction. That's called, Kalyanaya Vakati, means in the right direction, the auspicious direction, the literal meaning. That is, when we do something good, when we speak some good word, think some good thought, associate with people, whose association will give our mind, it's wonderful, it's a wonderful experience. So when we attend a prayer or puja or discussion or something, that is elevating. The mind is actually moving in an auspicious direction. It's called Kalyanaya Vakati. Vakati means it moves, it flows. The mind river, mind is compared to river, it moves in the positive direction. When we give some good food to the mind, means good vrittis, when we deposit some good vrittis in the mental system, that is chittam. So otherwise it moves in the opposite direction. Papaya Vakati means it moves in the opposite direction. If you feed your mind with all sorts of terrible vrittis, all the thrillers, all the mischievous stories, all that actually creates conflicts in our mind, negative ideas, skepticism, and you don't sleep, and people become a problem for others. That's because mind is moving in the negative direction. That is Papaya Vakati, means the mind river is flowing in the negative direction. Yatu Kaivalya Pragbhara Viveka Vishaya Nimna Sa Kalyana Vakha. So that means the mind is flowing in both directions, towards good and bad. That which flow in the right direction takes you towards liberation, towards spiritual enlightenment. And it takes you through the path of discrimination. Discrimination here means discerning wisdom. Discerning wisdom. That's the idea behind. Tatra vairagyena vishayasrotaha vilikriyate viveka darsana abhyasena viveka srotaha udghatite. So viveka means discerning wisdom. We should have this ability to use our own discerning wisdom, so that we will accept what is to be accepted and we will reject what is to be rejected. If we have that wisdom, when we are armed with that wisdom, then it takes us towards spiritual enlightenment. Samsara pragbhara aviveka vishedimna papavaha means, if you don't have that discerning wisdom, then it will take you the negative direction. And you should remember Yoga Sutras believe in reincarnation and the doctrine of karma. So if we feed our mind with negative food, negative vrittis, we suffer or enjoy, and we are born again and again. This cycle continues. Called karma vritti samsara chakram. This endless cycles of life, death and rebirth. This is Vyasa's very famous description of human mind. So it's called mind river, which flows in both directions. It has a potential to flow in both directions, the positive and negative. When we feed our mind with good vrittis, it moves in the proper direction. When we do not feed our mind with good vrittis, when we feed it with bad impressions, then it flows in the negative direction. So, we will continue this discussion in the next class. Thank you. We are open to ask questions, discussions. Most welcome.
Yeah. What causes these positive or negative vrittis? What is it that?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing there are two aspects to it. One is external influence, and the other is something inside of the mind that is impacted by this external influence and decides to move in this positive direction or negative direction. So how does this combination work?
Yeah. So our own inborn character, which in our mind, chittam, is a bundle of samskaras, impressions, with which we are born. So we are born with a psychological inheritance. The psychological inheritance is the spiritual capital bank balance we have got in the mental bank. Number of samskaras, good and bad. But we have the freedom, we have the potential to improve our own character. In fact, that's one of the great contributions of Vyasa, because Vyasa was the one who first wrote the well-known commentary. If we want, we can change and build our own destiny. So we are born with this the mind, mental system. Chittam is a more comprehensive term than what mind implies. So we are. It means it's called antakarana, which actually means the repository of memories, the feeling, the thoughts and counter thoughts, wavering mind, and our own sense of assertiveness. I am the one who is seeing this, and memory. All these are included in the word chitta. So we are born with that. That's why there are certain instinctive characteristics with which every human being is born. Circumstances do have an impact on our mind, but we are not entirely the creatures of circumstances. The way we react to circumstances depend upon the kind of psychological inheritance with which we are born. That's because of that inheritance, only a minor aspect is linked to heredity. Only certain characteristics shown during the early part of our life may have a direct connection link to family inheritance, either maternal or paternal heredity. But apart from that, we find that we were, after all, you have to remember, it is all based on the principle of reincarnation. If you don't believe the concept of reincarnation, rebirth, then Patanjali's Yoga Sutras don't make much sense. It's an important point, remember. This yoga's popularity has played an important role in this phenomenal increase in the number of people who believe in rebirth and reincarnation in modern United States. Yoga, of course, the popularity of yoga, and also Buddhism. Buddhism again, Buddhism got a lot of these from Yoga Shastra only, because even the Mahayana school of Yogacara, Vijnanavada, got that name because they were themselves practitioners of yoga tradition. So the heredity plays a role, but the impact of heredity will be exhausted by the time a person reaches 12th or 13th year. Afterwards, it depends upon different circumstances, different conditions. It's not an absolute precise analysis. You cannot draw a line and put in different columns and categorization, not possible. But to a large extent, what we are depends upon what we have been, what we were in our previous life. That's the central principle. And that determines how we respond to different circumstances, how we evaluate, how we interpret life, how we make use of our own life, and also different external circumstances. This idea.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Maharaj, question. Now, you mentioned it in the previous session also here. Is there the past vrittis?
Yeah.
When do they have a bigger role? Is it on the childhood or once after certain age?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Can
you elaborate on that, please?
Of course, past vrittis will always have an effect throughout life. What I said just now was the influence of heredity will be exhausted during the first few years of memory formations. Afterwards, what we are going to become will depend upon what we have been, what we are doing, what psychological, cultural inheritance with which we are born. That's why, the tendency to assert one's own personality, the tendency to go in our own way. This doesn't happen in certain cultures where, where seniority is some kind of a tyranny in family cultures. There, depending upon those circumstances, this may not always happen, but every individual has a desire and a tendency to assert freedom. This is very universal. An instinctive desire to assert his own identity. To be what he is, to do what he wants, what he considers to be good for him or her. That's there. That's one indication that parentage or family connection in this life is only an accident that is limited to this particular life. We were children of different parents in the past and will be children of different parents in future. Now this is, of course, again, this idea makes sense only if you take for granted the concept of reincarnation and the idea that life is not just one chance. That's the idea. Death is not a full stop. Death is only a coma, and you continue your existence in next life. That's the central underlying concept behind.
There is a question from YouTube, Maharaj, from Ranjana Somayaji. Is there a relationship between vikalpa and free will?
Yeah.
Is vikalpa through vasana due to previous birth?
Yeah. Of course, all the pancha vrittis, all these vrittis, how they operate will be to a great extent determined by the previous samskaras, no doubt about it. See, let us say vikalpa, as you know, as I mentioned, vikalpas may not necessarily have a corresponding object. Viparyaya is a knowledge of an object which is not actually that object, something else. That's what, so this is the. Now, in vikalpa, suppose we read books, we hear stories, we associate with persons which encourage the development of free will, then free will can become a vikalpa vritti. Patriotism can be a vikalpa vritti. Goodness, strength, truth, all these can become vikalpa vrittis, because vikalpa vrittis need not necessarily have a corresponding object, but becomes a powerful ideal. That's why as I quoted earlier, this is called, of course, vastu sunyate api sabdajnana mahatmya nibandhano vyavaharo drishyati. So vastu, there is no object there. Still, sabdajnana mahatmya nibandhana. Sabdajnana means patriotism, love for the country, free will, goodness, beauty. All these are sabdajnanas. Certain strong words, abstract concepts. Patriotism cannot have a human form. But viparyaya has a form, but he said the form is not what you mean in that context. But vikalpa can just be an abstract concept, conceptual knowledge. Shabdajnana. Vastusunyatvam and Shabdajnanatvam means there is no real object. Still, Shabdajnana Mahatma Nibandhanaha Vyavaharaha. You act. Vyavahara means you act, you behave, you interact. Think in this world, influenced by this abstract, profound ideas. That is called Shabdajnana Mahatmya. So free will can be an example of vikalpa, sacrifice. All these ideas are examples of vikalpa. This idea. So Vyasa gives a very precise. Vyasa Bhasha is much longer. I have just recited that fraction, that particular expression where Vyasa emphasizes the absence of a corresponding object and the presence of an abstract concept based on a word. These two ideas are emphasized. Means Vastusunyatvam and Sabdajnana Mahatmyam. The greatness, the grandeur of an abstract concept based on Shabda, based on a word. At the same time, the absence of a corresponding visual, concrete object. I give you example. Free will is an example, patriotism is an example, strength is an courage. All these are examples. Yeah. When a person, suppose he reads the story of a great hero, the hero's picture is there. He may forget the person's name or anything, but for a long time he may have desire to practice the great quality that embodied in that great person whose biography he read. So the great men inspire people, mostly through these vikalpas. Great men, great women, they all have a permanent impact on human civilization. They continue influencing, inspiring people for centuries because of this abstract idea which becomes a rallying point, a source of inspiration. Yeah. Okay. So I think we don't have many more questions. Of course, we have enough time.
There is one question, Maharaj. Yeah. It's on Zoom. I'll read it for that person, Subhendru. Why do we look at cycle of birth, death and rebirth in a negative sense? Human life is a wonderful experience. Yeah. What is wrong in reliving this experience? If we liberate from this life cycle, what is the nature of existence in nirvana state?
Yeah. You know, it's again a matter of one's own choice. If anybody feels living this world is wonderful, actually living this world is not bad. It is certainly a wonderful experience. But it becomes more wonderful when we find a higher meaning. And when we look for a meaning, sometimes at one stage we start thinking of the deeper meaning of existence. What is life all about? What's the ultimate destination of human being? What's the destiny of human beings? Is there a God? What is the mystery of human life and so on? These questions can occur to certain persons, not necessarily to everyone. So remember, this rebirth and law of karma are not looked upon in a negative manner in yoga and Vedanta. But in Buddhism, this samsara, this continued life cycles, birth, life, death and rebirth, it's called praditya samutpada, this 12-link chain. It's all because of trishna, because of desire, clinging to life. We want to be born, we want to enjoy. So that makes us bound to this world. So Buddha is specifically mentioned this point. But remember, Buddhism takes one very important aspect of Vedanta and gives it a humanistic interpretation. That's all. Vedanta and yoga generally do not look upon life or rebirth as a big problem, as something to be feared, to be worried about. But it tells that there is something beyond that. What is there beyond that need not necessarily be an inquiry for everyone. Not necessarily. There is no pessimism in yoga and Vedanta. Even in Buddhism, there is no pessimism. There is a different outlook. Is life nothing but just birth, living wonderfully, and dying, again coming back? So, is there something higher than this? That's what Buddha actually thought about. And for that, he was inspired by these three visions: the reality of old age, death, and sickness. That need not necessarily make you a philosopher, but there are certain people who may take to philosophy when they see these things. Not everyone. Depends upon where we stand. Buddha could think of life as something to be transcended. Buddha could think of old age, death and sickness as a problem to be transcended only in his 544th life. In 543 previous life cycles, he did not become Buddha. So, when we reach that stage of evolution, then we may also one day start thinking, well, is there something beyond all this? So that's an important thing. In fact, in Yoga Sutra itself, it's called pramana. It's called parinama samskara. Parinama tapa samskaraihi guna visheshacha dukkhameva sarvam vivekinaha. There's a famous sutra, I think, in Sadhanapada. Pramana. So well, I can explain this. Maybe it's a very important question you have raised, and very philosophical question. So I would like to go deeper into this. So please wait a minute. I shall try to explain the sutra. The sutra I know by memory, but the descriptions I shall give. The sutra is pramana tapa samskara dukkhehi guna visheshacha dukkhameva sarvam vivekinaha. That is the sutra. Just a minute. Yeah. Sorry, please remember, those who are interested, you can read Sadhanapada, 15th Sutra. As I mentioned, Parinama Tapa Samskara Dukkhehi Gunavritti Visheshacha Dukkhameva Sarvam Vivekina. What it means is 3 types of samskara. That is Parinama Samskara, Tapa Samskara, and Dukkha Samskara. Now, the point is, to a person, Vivekina means to a person who is endowed with Viveka. What is Viveka? Higher discerning wisdom, higher intuition, the ability to look for higher meaning in life. And you know what Vyasa says, very profound. Vyasa says, Parinama dukkhada nama pratikula sukhavasthayam api yoginameva krishnati. Vyasa Bhashyam. But he says, the Parinama Dukkhada. Parinama Dukkha means an understanding of the incompleteness, the imperfection of life as it happens in this world generally. Dukkha doesn't mean pain or grief or sorrow. Dukkha means the ability to look to look upon something as incomplete or imperfect. So the English translation sometimes can be sufficiently misleading. Dukkha is not grief. Buddha was not crying and weeping. Buddha was an enlightened person. And he was a great prince. He lived in luxury. When he saw a sick man, old man, and dead body being taken to the cremation ground, he was not crying and weeping. Rather, he became contemplative, introspective, thoughtful. Maybe like an Aristotle, Plato, or Socrates. He became thoughtful. And he looked for a higher meaning in life. Is there a life where we need not worry, where we do not have to worry about death, old age, or sickness? Buddha was intelligent enough to understand you cannot have life in this world with some of these problems. After all, death is a problem which everyone will have to encounter. Old age, you cannot avoid. You can postpone if you want, but you cannot avoid. So, but there is something incomplete about it. This ability to look upon life as incomplete because it comes to an end one day. Body becomes old one day. This is certainly something that implies its essential incompleteness, in imperfection of physical life. So there should be a higher meaning in life. That's why parinama dukkha pratikula sukhavasthaya. See, actually you don't feel this kind of incompleteness normally when life is going on well for you. You are a rich man, you have perfect health, a big company, and very lot of power, everything. Still you feel this is not good enough for me. I should look for higher wisdom. The ability to see incompleteness, even in luxury, even in health, even in joy, in luxurious life, that is possible only for a highly evolved person. Buddha was not poor, he was not unhealthy, he was not sick, and he was not old. Still, he wanted to look for a higher meaning for these problems. So if you can think of higher meaning, in spite of the fact that everything is going on well for you, then you should be an exceptionally intelligent, cultured, refined person. That's what Vyasa says. See, yoginam eva krishnadi. That happens to only to yogis. Yogis means highly evolved persons. So we should not ever imagine that everyone should look upon life as a big burden. Not at all. Life is wonderful, fine, no problem. But maybe in some distant life we may realize, in spite of all these wonderful things, there is something not so very wonderful. And at that time we may turn to higher meaning in life. That's what Yoga Sutras says. I hope it's clear. Okay.
That's all, Maharaj.
Yeah.
No more questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu